For more reaction to the G20 summit, we're joined by John B. Emerson. He joins me now from Los Angeles, and he served as U.S. ambassador to Germany until this past January. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, we've heard these multiple reports suggest that the U.S. is more isolated at this G20 summit because of President Trump's policies. I'm curious, what do you make of that?
Well, you know, I think that it was interesting. We had Barack Obama to Germany shortly after the election, and he had a meeting with the chancellor that was known as the Quint, which is the four major European countries as well as the United States. And he commented to me afterwards that the importance of these meetings is the opportunity to pull together the leaders of the other countries and really not even so much what happens in the meetings, but the meetings on the margin of the meetings where you can really move forward and take a leadership role in building consensus on dealing with some of the larger issues that we confront. And I think the good thing about this G20 is it sounds like the president had some very good and very strong meetings on the margin. And as you suggested, often that's where all the action is at these kinds of conferences. I think the disappointing thing is that perhaps the United States was not in as much of a leadership role in this G20 as it has been in past ones. Obviously, climate change is a big issue. If you look back at the last G20, it was Chancellor Merkel and President Obama and President Xi who really took a leadership role on climate change. That's obviously an area where the United States has chosen to step back, and so we weren't there on that. I haven't seen a readout of other agreements that were reached at the G20 to determine whether some of the American objectives were in fact advanced there. But I think there's a risk of creating a vacuum of leadership that I think only China and Russia will be too eager to fill.
Okay, and President Trump also met with Chinese President Xi today. And after they had a very friendly start of their relationship, and it appears somewhat strained over the tensions of North Korea. The president even vented his frustration on Twitter before the G20. Do you think the president's approach to China and North Korea is working?
Well, I think that's going to remain to be seen. I mean, one thing about the Chinese is they are playing a long ball. They really are focused very much on the long term, and I think the relationship with China, it's sort of been a little bit of an up and down. You know, you had a good meeting in Mar-a-Lago, then you had a kind of a tweet that certainly raised some questions. I know there's frustration on the part of this administration. There was frustration on the part of the Obama administration about China perhaps not using as much of its influence and force as it could with North Korea. North Korea does 85% of its trade with China. It really depends on China for, just survival, if nothing else. And that's a lot of leverage that China has that perhaps it's not using. On the other hand, obviously, China doesn't want two things for sure. One is they don't want a flood of refugees from North Korea coming into China if that regime should fall. And secondly, they don't want to see a reunified peninsula because in their view that would put the United States basically on China's border because that's how they would see that. So that's sort of the tension that we're dealing with. But I really think it's too soon to make a judgment on whether this approach, which is not dissimilar to the approach that we've been taking before. There's a little bit more saber rattling here, which is quite different from the approach that was taken by President Obama. But it's too early to tell whether this is working or not. And part of the problem is, as it relates to North Korea, we have very little intelligence and very little information coming out of that regime. Our ability to sort of understand what's happening there is quite limited. The Chinese perhaps have much better insight, so hopefully we were able to get some of that insight from those meetings.
Yeah, it always surprises me what little we actually know about North Korea and Kim Jong-un. I want to ask you, though, about the much talked about meeting between Putin and President Trump. President Trump called it a tremendous meeting. Then Russia says that that the U.S. accepts Putin's assurances that he didn't meddle in the election. Two differing accounts of exactly what happened. What do you make of this and the fact that the U.S. says that they're going to work together on cybersecurity?
Well, working together on cybersecurity is huge, and let's not forget that it's not just the Russians, but it's the Koreans, the North Koreans in particular, who have been using that, weaponizing cybersecurity. And that's also an issue I hope that the President talked to President Xi about as well, how to kind of contain that within North Korea. But look, on it's almost, I think not enough attention is given to the cyber danger here. It's almost that we need a mutually assured destruction kind of pact that sort of governed nuclear issues during the Cold War as it relates to cyber. What we do not need is state actors or non-state actors crashing our financial systems, our air traffic control systems, our energy grid systems. And candidly, a lot of these nations are pretty close to having the capability of doing that. At least it feels that way from some of the things I've read. So, so I think it's important to focus on that. In terms of Trump and Putin, or I guess it's more Tillerson and Lavrov, having different readouts of what was said vis-a-vis the Russian meddling, interference in our elections, which clearly happened, by the way. It's very clear from
U.S.
the intelligence services. Yeah, they rarely stand out and agree so much on anything. That thing they've absolutely agreed upon. But it doesn't trouble me so much that they had different views. That's often typical of diplomatic meetings. Don't forget, you know, Trump's playing to his domestic audience at home. Putin's playing to his domestic audience at home. And so I think that it's not a shock that we would have different readouts. And candidly, this is something that Lavrov it's typical of Lavrov's behavior to come out and do that.
You know, something else that Putin said today was that Syria, there will be a ceasefire there as a result of the U.S. changing its stance. Is this a win-win for him? And what do you think President Trump and the U.S. gets out of this?
Well, I think anytime there's a real ceasefire in Syria, and the area that they're talking about, as I understand it, is sort of the southwestern part of Syria where there's been limited fighting, so at least currently. So probably a good area to start, probably an easy area to start. First of all, the success of that is going to really depend on the people on the ground and their, you know, their handlers, if you will. In this case, Russia, I think, plays a significant role in dealing with the Syrian army and making sure that that the ceasefire holds. But anytime we have a ceasefire in Syria, given what has happened and the tragedy of what's happened in that country over the past 4 or 5 years, I think is a good thing, and it's something that we ought to build on. And then the next step, of course, has to be designing a political process where there can be a solution, political solution to what's the next step in terms of government and leadership in Syria. And I don't see any way that Assad, who effectively has gone to war against his own people, has used chemical weapons and poisonous gas, sarin gas against his own people, can come through that process as still being in charge of Syria. So I think that's something that's a little bit trickier. It's something I know Secretary Kerry worked on quite diligently when he was Secretary of State with a number of our allies in trying to get to that place. And so hopefully one ceasefire leads to a bigger ceasefire, leads to that. But boy, there's a long way between here and there.
And John, speaking of diplomacy, 12 of the 19 other countries in the G20 don't have ambassadors from the U.S., including Germany. You were actually the last ambassador, U.S. ambassador. You left in January. What effect do you think that has on how the administration deals with the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's troubling. Let's not forget, though, I was President Obama's first ambassador of his second term to get to post, and I didn't get there until mid-August. And the reason is the background checks, you're at the highest level of security clearance, and the Senate confirmation process take time. I was perceived as someone who flew through it in light speed, and I still didn't get there till August. So the fact that ambassadors aren't in place right now is not shocking, assuming that they're here. It was about 4 years ago that my hearing actually took place. What is surprising and disappointing is that many of these ambassadors have not yet even been nominated, and of course you can't go through the confirmation process until you've been nominated. And I do think it's problematic. I think countries really look at the American ambassador. The ambassador is the personal representative of the President of the United States. So if a president doesn't have an ambassador in a country, it's almost insulting to that country that he or she doesn't feel like they want to have a personal rep, or that it's a priority to have a personal representative there. So, you know, I always joke with my American friends that, you know, most Americans can't name a single ambassador to our country, except maybe now this guy Kislyak from Russia, because he's on the news all the time. But in point of fact, most people who pay attention to government, to politics, to business, know the American ambassador to their country. So it's significant. It's an indication of interest. It's an indication that, you know, the relationship with that particular country is important, and I think it's important to get done. And I would say that also to the United States Senate. You know, they really took their time in approving a lot of the Obama second-term ambassadors, and I think it's important to move this process, once they are nominated, to move them through quickly to an up or down vote, so we can get them in place.
Ambassador John Emerson from Los Angeles, thank you for joining us, Ambassador.
Thank you, my pleasure.